Hello everybody, Gage here from Sharp Knife Shop. We are a specialty knife store located in Hamilton, Canada, and we specialize in Japanese handcrafted kitchen knives. With that said, you might assume that we would always recommend a Japanese knife for whatever task you are trying to tackle in the kitchen, but this would in fact be untrue. We find that there is always a time and a place for both Japanese and German knives. Every toolbox needs a hammer, and a German knife is always handy to have in your toolkit. But with all of that said, today we thought we'd talk about some of the differences between Japanese and German knives and help you decide which is the appropriate knife for you. So the first and most glaring difference between Japanese and German knives is going to be the steel type that's used to make these knives. Most, if not all, Japanese knives are made from either a high carbon stainless steel or a carbon steel. German knives, on the other hand, are typically going to be made from softer stainless steels without as much carbon content as their Japanese counterparts. So what does this mean for you, the user? Well, basically it means that the German knife is not going to hold its edge or stay sharp as long as a Japanese knife. This is because the carbon content in the steel is going to determine a thing called the Rockwell hardness of the knife. The Rockwell hardness is a measurement used to determine how hard the steel is, and generally speaking, the higher the Rockwell hardness, the longer your knife is going to stay sharp for. Japanese knives typically come in around the 59 to as high as 68 mark on the Rockwell scale, whereas German knives are going to come in at around 54 to 56. So quite a bit softer, meaning they are not going to hold their edge quite as long. Now, while this softness may not contribute to a very long-lasting edge, it is going to make the knife a little less susceptible to chipping and other such damage. Japanese knives are very prone to chipping, especially ones that get very, very thin behind the edge. And while this does contribute to an excellent cutting feel, which we'll touch on a little bit later, it does, of course, make the knife a little bit more delicate. This also will impact the flexibility of the knife as well. Knives with a higher Rockwell hardness are not going to be very flexible. They're going to be quite rigid, which is again going to contribute to their chippiness. German knives, on the other hand, with that softer steel, are going to be able to achieve a very flexible blade. So if you're looking for a really flexy boning knife, the German style boning knife is going to be the way to go.
The fillet knife. Oh, me.
So the next topic we're going to talk about is weight. Japanese knives are not always, but typically much lighter than their German counterparts. There are a couple reasons for this, which we'll touch on later in the video. But generally speaking, a lighter knife is going to cause less fatigue, especially when being used for long periods of time. A German knife, being a little bit heavier, is going to require more energy to push the knife and pull it back through and back through ingredients. And this is going to cause your arm to fatigue and more specifically your wrist to fatigue a little bit quicker than using a lighter Japanese knife. This also kind of ties into the balance differences between the two knives, where Japanese knives are typically balanced further forward in the blade, whereas German knives are typically balanced a little bit further back towards the handle. Now, this is largely a personal preference thing, but most people that we have come into our shop that get to try a Japanese knife for the first time quickly get very used to and tend to prefer the knife that is balanced further forward in the blade, as it feels like the knife is sort of pulling itself through ingredients and doing much of the work for you. Whereas a German knife, being weighted further back in the handle, requires you to apply a little bit more force to get it through an ingredient. So on that note of having to push harder through ingredients with a German knife, kind of ties in nicely to the differences in edge geometry and profile of both Japanese and German knives. German knives are typically going to be much thicker both at the spine and behind the edge, whereas a Japanese knife is going to be much thinner both at the spine and behind the edge. This is going to really contribute to a vast difference in cutting feel between the two styles of knives, where that thicker spine and thickness behind the edge of a German knife is going to cause ingredients to sort of wedge apart more as you're cutting through. And this, of course, is not going to contribute to a very effortless cutting feel. It does make the knife quite a bit more rigid and durable. If you're looking for pure performance and excellent cutting feel, there's no argument that the thinner Japanese knife is going to move through ingredients better. Now, of course, we've already touched on this, but the thinner the knife, the more delicate it's going to be. So while you are getting better cutting performance with a Japanese knife, you have to be a little bit more careful using one, as they can be more prone to chipping and other such damage. Next, we're going to talk about the profile of the knife. And if you're unfamiliar, this speaks to the curvature or lack thereof on the knife. You may also come across the term belly in your research, which again just speaks to the curvature of the blade. Now, German knives are typically going to have much more belly or curve to the blade, and this is because they are typically used in a more rocking motion. So these knives will typically never leave the board once you put them down to chop something. The tip of your knife is going to remain planted on the board as you use a rocking motion to cut through ingredients. Japanese knives can certainly achieve this rocking motion, but you won't be able to get them up as high as you will a German knife, which is typically why most people use a more push and pull or up and down chopping motion when using a Japanese knife. Now, the importance of having a flat profile for this cutting style is that when you're using an up and down chopping motion, you want as much of the knife's edge to contact the board so that you don't end up with little choo-choo trains of ingredients sort of stuck together as you're cutting through. Now, there may be some people that disagree with this statement, but I would argue that the push and pull or up and down chopping motion is superior to that of the rocking motion. And in my mind, for two reasons. Number one, your knife is going to dull faster when you're using a rocking motion, in my experience. Leaving it in contact with the board all the time and running it along the board more like that is going to cause more rolling of the edge over one side or the other, which of course is going to contribute to a more dull feeling edge. The push and pull cutting motion, in my mind, is also more efficient. So there's very little wasted energy or wasted movement when using a push and pull motion. You're pushing the knife through the ingredient, coming right back to the starting position. So no sort of wasted energy rolling the knife through as you're cutting. There are going to be circumstances, of course, where the rocking motion is certainly going to perform better, i.e. when chopping up herbs. However, on the whole, I would argue that using a push and pull motion is going to be better and more efficient. Now, of course, we're speaking very generally about profiles here. You're going to come across German knives with a flatter profile, and you're going to come across Japanese knives with a more curved profile. But again, generally speaking, a Japanese knife is going to have a flatter profile, more in line with that up and down chopping motion. Next, we're talking about bolsters. German knives have a bolster, Japanese knives do not have a bolster. If you're unfamiliar, a bolster is this big old chunk of steel close to the heel of the knife on German knives, and it is used as a bit of a balance point on a German knife, and also to give you a little bit of a guard for your middle finger should you be using a pinch grip, which you should be. Now, a lot of home cooks feel comfortable with this bolster because it's familiar to them, and also because they feel like it provides a little bit of safety on the knife. So this bolster is going to contribute to one serious problem with German knives, which is that they cannot be properly sharpened from tip to heel. This is because that bolster is not going to wear away at the same rate as the edge of your knife, and it's going to stay the same size, creating this sort of divot in your knife where the knife is not going to make contact with the board when you're chopping. The only way to remove this bolster is either with a belt grinder or with a Toma diamond plate, which are both very expensive tools to own. So having a Japanese knife with no bolster, which allows you to sharpen properly the entire length of the edge, is certainly going to be a big advantage. Any knife, no matter how expensive it is going to need to be sharpened. So being able to effectively sharpen your knife all the way from tip to heel and maintain the profile is certainly going to be an advantage. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If there's anything in this video that we didn't touch on that you were hoping to learn, or maybe you completely disagree with all of our opinions, make sure to leave a comment down below with all the rest of the material engineers. If you liked this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more knife-related content. And until the next video, stay sharp.